Good evening, everybody. First of all, I will notice that this hall is very crowded, as it has always been whenever Professor Wistrich makes an initiative. I've been here, I've been lucky enough to be here several times with him, and it has always been very warm and very full of genuine interest for the subjects that he has been able to develop so much in these years. I am Fiamma Nierenstein. I am Italian, and I'm also an historian by birth. I've been studying history, but I am a journalist and a writer. I've written several books, and some of them are about anti-Semitism, and I've been in the Italian Parliament for 5 years. I've been the Deputy President of the Commission of Foreign Affairs, and most of all, I'm a very good friend of Professor Wistrich. I'm very proud of that. I'm sitting here from the left to the right with Professor Jeffrey Herf, who is a professor in modern European, especially 20th century German political intellectual history at the University of Maryland in College Park, located in the metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. There is a very interesting and curriculum that brings him to several different universities to teach and to dip his subject. He's the author of 5 previous books because now in this presentation at this conference draws on a book in progress with the working title of German at War with Israel, East Germany and the West German Far Left during the Cold War. But there are many other books of his. They include reactionary modernism, technology, culture, and politics in Weimar and in the Third Reich. And he has been translated in many languages, like in Italian, Japanese, Spanish, Greek, and Portuguese, and Turkish. And his books deal with European culture, with a particular attention on Holocaust, World War II, and anti-Semitism. And, well, you know, about Professor Wistrich, I'm sure you know a lot. I'm always undecided if to call you Wistrich or Wistrich, you know, because I hear you called, how do you call yourself? You don't know, eh? So just the same as I, eh? Just the same as I. So I will start from the end of this biography that I have in my hands, where I see that the Allgemeine newspaper in New York selected him this year, the year that ended right now, as one of the 100 people whose editors considers to have exercised the most positive influence in the Jewish world. He was one of only 2 academics who make this list. You know, so this is really, well, it's not funny. I don't find it funny. I find it extremely serious. And I can have experimented this on myself. Professor Wistrich has had an important influence of my work, on my being interested in anti-Semitism and in being engaged in a lot of work for the Jewish people. Well, you know, the most famous things all of us know, like the fact that he has written A Lethal Obsession, Antisemitism from Antiquity to the Global Jihad, and many other books. What I can say about his books is that at the beginning, when you see them, they are all of this mole. So you, at the beginning, you feel frightened and shy. But then when you start reading them, you really understand that it has been worth every single page. And I will speak about the subject, about the subject itself of the book, and then I give the floor first. Who wants to speak first? I don't know. Okay, I will speak first, but then you will speak, and then you probably conclude, no? You better conclude.
You decide.
No, I can't decide. I will let...
If you want, I'll go first. Okay, I'll go first. You don't want to.
So, what so you will speak first, and then Robert. But I will say a few words before everybody starts with his thoughts. First of all, I really feel very honored, mostly after having read all of this book. I've read it and underlined all of this because this is the most important thing to say, there are plenty and plenty of things that you can read there to understand the present from the past. This is the regular path that you follow in your books. You give us elements that will teach us how to understand. This book represents a landmark for the large vision and sharp interpretation of anti-Semitism in the past century. It brings us straight today to the understanding of why anti-Semitism has become an extremely worrying phenomena in the contemporary war. You know, when I was small, I thought that after World War II, everything had changed about anti-Semitism and the Jews. I think that many of you shared my idea and were surprised afterward along our life to see how not only this is not true, but things are becoming worse and worse. The signs were all there. And Wistrich shows us how the poisonous anti-Jewish legacy that today condemns Israel to death from the red-green axis in the leftist side, in the Muslim leftist side, has complex, important roots already prefigured in the 19th century seedbed of the anti-Semitic socialism and finds its definition in Marx, Proudhon, and Fourier. We could say with a simplified vision that one of the first things that we learn through the page of Wistrich encyclopedic book, because it's a real encyclopedic book that gives you information about every single thinker of last and this century, that left-wing anti-Semitism has a million of different faces, and you must confront it on many unexpected sides. On the other side, the right wing has been always heavily and constantly based on the Paleo-Christian view that has ended up in fascism and Nazism and has developed into traditional concept deriving from the idea that the Jews are Jesus killers. That's the right side. With the left is completely different. Leftist anti-Semitism is a Promethean multi-phase and basically secular and not religious ideology. And if we grasp it on one side, it will run away, presenting its raison d'etre from the other. If we fight it, for instance, demonstrating that Zionism has never been and never will be racist, never be anti-democratic or discriminatory, or never pursue the genocide of the Palestinians, they will simply not listen. They will find good reason to affirm that this is true. You know, and this is just because of this multifaceted ideology that Wistrich presents in his pages. One says that the Jews are capitalist and imperialist. The other says that they are an archaic form of culture that has been never overwhelmed and destroyed and should be because it's too ancient to survive. The other that they are cosmopolitan and therefore basically traitors of their guest nations. The other that they are natural allies of capitalism or even its own father, and the other that the opposite, that they are the true breaker of any established order and willing destroyer of civilization. So you find so many different faces, and you understand how they all just came into this river. They merge in this fight of the left against the Jews, and have so big roots that it's strange to to imagine how much, and I will come to this, the Jews have been faithful to the left in a way after the Second World War. I will come to this. You know, it's very hard for anybody who has been a leftist or is a leftist to accept what is described in the book of Wistrich. When I was a young girl and a feminist, I founded a monthly review by the name of Rosa. That was inspired by the name of Rosa Luxemburg. But not only of this. Rosa is the flower. Rosa means pink in Italian. And I was not prepared to learn that she always denied any possibility of emancipation of the Jewish people and even of an existence, a real existence of the Jewish people, if not inside the workers' movement or connected to the workers' movement. Her tones with the well-known position of Marx, Bruno Bauer, Lazar, Trotsky, Kreisky, Deutscher, Jewish and non-Jewish politicians and thinkers, and of course of Lenin and Stalin, where variation and rethinking, very often dictated by opportunistic reasons, showed the losing fight of reason and reality against fantasy, fidelity, blind fidelity to an idea, devotion to the biggest totem of the past century, socialism, communism, sometimes anarchism. First, Judaism and then Zionism, Wistrich demonstrates, are the victim of an immense holocaust, of any positive thinking about the Jews and their dream toward identity, independency, dignity, modernity, democracy. All of this has been denied one by one by these thinkers, and this is really amazing and you know, surprising in a way. All of these modern aspirations are denied by the idea that the Jews are either dinosaurs bound to disappear, or parasites that are a damage to the society. Basically, I think that these are the two streams that the socialist thought has been taking in the past. There is also today, and I have noticed this in this day, a new form of anti-Semitism that you speak about relating to that, but now we see it in the making. We are watching on the rise in these days through the story of the anti-Semitism of the son of immigrant comic Dieudonné. And it is an open countercultural trend, as Wistrich call it. Here you have an immigrant whose flag is the flag of anti-Semitism. This is really very interesting in a way. I mean, and very new. The eclectic ideology of human rights mixed with traditional progressivism and post-national cosmopolitanism that has stepped into the vacuum left by the bankruptcy of Marxism. Dieudonné, the black son of immigrants that hates the Jews and makes his flags and his fight out of it, is a very new, discouraging front of struggle. I have noted, reading the beginning of the book, that the introduction, that my biography, even with some years of distance, is very similar to Robert's. I also have been pushed toward the research and the engagement about anti-Semitism by personal experience. 67 war saw me as a girl in a kibbutz in the north, Neot Mordechai. When I came back to Italy, my communist friends considered me a traitor. I'm afraid that this is, I'm sorry, I forgot it. You know, I would never find it. See, from my communist friends, they consider me a traitor. the fight against Israeli imperialism had started. The communist and Cold War definition of the Israeli-Arab conflict had completely conquered my friends. Nobody thought about the reasons of Israel. Nobody considered them. And I became for them an unconscious fascist. This is what I became. Also, my father has been for the communist an unconscious fascist. Communist and leftist and Zionist as he was. When my father, who had always been a leftist, who came to Italy with the Jewish brigade from Israel, it was not yet Israel, he came with the Jewish brigade to marry afterwards with an Italian Jewish partisan, a communist too, my mom, went to Poland after a few years to get information about his family that had been deported and killed from Baranov to Sobibor. He was confronted by a group of local hooligans that intimated him, a Jew that came to seek for his and his family past, to run away. The plan was just to kill him, you know, they threatened to kill him. He was very severely threatened. Communism was not a sufficient deterrent to keep those Polish from aggressing a Jew who came back to look for the ashes of his family. On the opposite, my father, as a Jew and a Zionist, was an object of threat and then of a very well-organized persecution. He was confined in Poland for 4 years by the people and by the government. He was just from the two sides, who might have considered him a Zionist spy. It's a long story and it would deserve a longest speech. I would like to notice here, I'm almost through, that the European Jews that were left lost and bleeding among the ashes of what once was their country and their culture, which had revealed a monstrous ideological and physical trap, saw in the left the ideological home of their poor souls. This is what unbelievably happened afterwards. And the left, having been the European enemy to Nazi fascism, took possession of their soul, decided that a Jew cannot be but leftist. Not be leftist became impossible for a Jew, socially and politically. The left, and most of all the leftist Jews, pretend, and still it is just like this today, that the Jews are ontologically tied to the left. I quote this point because I think that speaking of the subjective point of view of the Jews, beyond the many theorization of the leaders of the workers' movement that has been in the desperate research of the Jews of a new hometown, beyond the civilization that had killed 6 million of them, the identification of the left as a natural hometown. The Jewish have taught to be ontologically leftist. And of course, the left has made a lot of pressure, and I know something about that. And whoever is not, paradoxically, is not a Jew, doesn't respond to the moral request that a Jew is bound for. Human rights is the first front. I have lived this personally and seen friends of mine suffering of the accusation that they were against human rights because human rights belong to the left, which is a complete lie, and it's today very well described in the, not in the last chapter, but the chapter before the last, the penultimo, right? Mm. Let's also note that while the supposition that you are a real Jew only if you are a leftist is common, the opposite has never been proposed. The right has never said if you are not a rightist, you are not a Jew, or you as a Jew must be rightist. Nothing like that exists. It's, this is an attribute only of the left. And I think this is extremely interesting. For sure, all the left-wing culture of those years was impregnated with the 100 years long anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist culture that Wistrich here explains to us in an ultimative way. And that is also the reason why I would say that today anti-Zionism is the real and only heritage of that culture. Professor Wistrich teaches us here all the reasons why the depth of that, not marginal, but central culture. And this is another thing that you learn here, that anti-Semitism is a central culture. I'm sorry, but all of this telephone keep ringing. I would add on my own that I think that we can start, and this is the last sentence, understanding how anti-Semitism is, of course, the real root for that, but we can notice clearly and plainly that almost all the anti-Semitism is today transferred on Israel. I could speak for hours about that, but I think that Professor Wistrich will do it much better than mine. The European governments and intellectual elites have refused the heritage of anti-Semitism. Schools and ceremonies all over Europe tell us this, and we can be satisfied when we see how the Kristallnacht has been remembered. For instance, in Germany, Professor, you will tell me much more about that. But you know, as a matter of words, the leaders of the European countries are the most tough fighters against anti-Semitism, and then you see that this is not true. And where do you see that this is not true? When Israel becomes the subject of the conversation or of the position of the leaders. This is what happens nowadays. Lies and prejudice have today this sign, which I call Israelophobia. Wistrich studies brings us to understand all of this. This is what I had, and this is what I had to say. Okay. So now, as we promised before, I will gladly give the floor to Professor Jeffrey Herf, please.
Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be speaking here again at Hebrew University, along with my friend and colleague Robert Wistrich. And the most important events in Europe that concern the survival or the non-survival of the State of Israel were those that took place in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and in East Germany. Because the difference between the Soviet bloc and the Red Brigades and in Italy and the Red Army faction in West Germany was that these were states. They had foreign ministries. They had controlled newspapers. They had armies. They had intelligence agencies. They had vast amounts of money. They had universities. They had the ability to attract and train thousands of young people from all over the Third World, as well as the Arab world, in the use of arms that could be used against the State of Israel. And they did so. So the proper term to characterize the relationship of the very small state called the German Democratic Republic, an ironic title, and its relationship to the State of Israel was not ambivalence or a difficult relationship. The core argument of the book that I'm working on, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about it because this is Robert's evening, the core argument of this book is that the proper relationship, the proper noun to apply to the relationship between the German Democratic Republic and the governments of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. The proper noun to apply to their relationship to the State of Israel is to be in a state of war. And that if the policies of the Soviet bloc had succeeded, if the United States had lost the Cold War, the State of Israel would have been destroyed. The state of war involved active participation in a propaganda offensive, which included accusations against the State of Israel that remain the predominant accusations against the State of Israel to the present day. There is literally nothing new that is said about how evil and terrible the state of Israel is in the contemporary world that was not formally stated by the communists during the Cold War. The East Germans played an active, willing, and enthusiastic role in New York, in the United Nations. And as I look around the room, I think there are people here old enough to remember Yosef Tekoa and Gideon Raphael and Chaim Herzog. And these diplomats, these Israeli diplomats in New York, wrote a page of Israeli history that is noble and heroic and remarkable. And they left behind a massive documentary record that historians will be using for a long time to come. They were noble in defeat, but Israel lost the propaganda war, the ideological war at the United Nations for many decades. The East Germans, the East Germans provided about 3% of the military weapons that came from the Soviet bloc to Syria, to Egypt, to the Palestine Liberation Organization. It's important to keep in mind this was a state with 17 million people, a very small state compared to the Soviet Union, but it played its role enthusiastically in training the military armed forces of the Arab states and the Palestinian terrorist organizations from the 1960s to the 1980s. The East Germans, and I have not done research in this regard. I've worked in the files of the Ministry of State Security, the so-called Stasi, the East German Defense Ministry, the Politburo, and these files are all open. So we know that the East German government entered into formal written agreements with the intelligence services of the government of Hafez al-Assad Sr., Syria, with Nasser's Egypt, with Arafat's PLO, at the time when all of these organizations and states were either at war with Israel or engaged in terrorist attacks on Israel. They supplied a broad range of weapons for the Arab states and the terrorist organizations. These measures were justified for East Germany because of the overall ideology of communist anti-imperialism. Israel, and you all are familiar with this, was denounced by the communists as the spearhead of American imperialism in the Middle East. So there was a conspiracy theory at work here, but the conspiracy theory had nothing to do with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. But it was instead the conspiracy theory of Lenin's argument regarding global imperialism. So Israel was not the center of this global conspiracy, rather the United States was the center of this global conspiracy, and Israel had made the disastrous decision to throw in its lot with the United States. For East Germany, its passion and enthusiasm for the attack on Israel was fueled by another very practical argument. East Germany was seeking diplomatic recognition by states outside of the Soviet bloc. In 1969, it achieved its greatest diplomatic breakthrough when, in addition to being recognized by King Sihanouk's Cambodia, for reasons we don't have to go into, it also received diplomatic recognition in June and July of 1969 from Iraq, from Egypt, from Syria. This was the huge breakthrough, and the reason that Iraq and Syria, Egypt, Yemen, and the Arab states recognized East Germany was because East Germany was opposed to Israel. And the East Germans played this to the anti-Zionist card to the hilt, and they presented themselves to the Arabs as the good Germans who were opposed to Zionism, who were opposed to imperialism, as opposed to the bad Germans in West Germany, who were in favor of imperialism and in favor of Zionism. So communist ideology and national self-interest reinforced one another. The fundamental year in the radicalization of the European left, and here Ms. Nierenstein, I think, referred to the War of '67, was 1967, much more important than 1968. 1968 had global significance because of the Tet Offensive, but the Six-Day War in 1967 was not a turning point for the communists in the Soviet bloc, though it was for some people in the Western left. But in 1967, Western Europe and the United States was somewhat stunned by a speech that Walter Ulbricht gave. Would you go to the next slide, please? Oh goodness me, that doesn't. We have a technical glitch here. The next slide. Maybe the next slide will be better. Can you move it over here? It may be if you could just move the computer a bit. I think. Yeah. Yeah. There we go. There's a low-tech explanation. Yeah, well, we may just forget about that. The Ulbricht gave a speech. There we go. All right. Ulbricht gave a speech in Leipzig in June 15th of 1967, in which he denounced Israeli imperialism and aggression, expressed his full solidarity with the Arab states, and the Politburo minutes indicate that the Politburo in June 6th and 7th of 1967 did a number of interesting things. First, they promised to Nasser and to Assad military support. That is, and we now know that they were sending tanks and artillery equipment and Kalashnikovs to the Egyptians and to the Syrians, and we have. I'm not going to bore you with numbers and details, but we have them. Albert Norden, a member of the Politburo, then asked Jewish members of the Jewish community in East Germany who were still there to sign a statement supporting the East German government. A number of them refused, but the pressure on the Jews in East Germany intensified. And then Ulbricht compared Israel's war in 1967 to the Nazi blitzkrieg in Eastern Europe. He referred to the Sinai Protectorate, and he used language which his German audience would associate with the language of Nazi occupation in Eastern Europe. All the while that the East Germans and the Soviets were denouncing Zionism as racism, that began very early on. They surrounded this hostility in a rhetorical fog and a game of cat and mouse, in which they argued that, in fact, they were in favor of the United Nations Resolution 242 of 1967, which recognized Israel's right to exist, but they never repeated in public that Israel had a right to exist. They associated this state with aggression, with occupation, with exploitation, colonialism, with every sin that one could imagine. At the same time that they gave active support to those who were attempting to destroy it. So in its consequence, and Robert will certainly have something to say about this, in its consequence, anti-Semitism was a policy of anti-Semitism. It attributed a level of evil and conspiratorial power to Israel that drew sustenance from previous anti-Semitic ideologies. It offered moral legitimation for destroying this country by force of arms, and it aided those in the Middle East who were actively attempting to do exactly that. So my current work is about the intersection of ideas and politics, and it's more about the details of policy and what these ideas led to. And because I want to be brief, I just want to tell a few stories that illustrate the depth and the passion of the alliance of East Germany with its Arab allies. And so I'll introduce a few names here that may not be quite as familiar. Walter Ulbricht's name, of course, is quite familiar, but one person who may not be quite as well known is Heinz Hoffmann. And Heinz Hoffmann was the defense minister of East Germany from 1960 to 1985. Would you please scroll ahead until I tell you, keep going. It would stop there. Go back to this previous, Heinz Hoffmann was the defense minister in these years. After the loss of the war in 1967, the Soviet Union was furious with the Arabs. It was a huge humiliation for the Red Army and Air Force and the Soviet military. The Soviets were furious because they were saying, we have given weapons to the Arabs that are better than the weapons we have given to the Vietnamese. Look what the Vietnamese can do with what we've given to them. And the Arabs simply can't shoot. They're incompetent. Their leadership is full of bourgeois reactionaries. They need to be trained. They need to do better, and we are going to do it. We're going to resupply them. We're going to train them, and they will do better the next time. And the East Germans were part of that effort, so that the next time there would not be yet another humiliation of Soviet arms in the Middle East. And a man who was at the center of that resupply and that retraining and that deepening of an alliance was Hoffman, who was a veteran communist, and in 1971, he visited Syria and he visited Egypt, and this is a photo, which is it's kind of hard to see. I don't know what technology is a little bit problematic here. Better, good, better, best. So this is a very important photo. The gentlemen on the left side of this table include Heinz Hoffmann, the defense minister of East Germany, Admiral Werner, the head of the East German Navy, and on this side of the table is Mustafa Talas and the other leaders of the Syrian General Staff. And they are meeting in Damascus in 1971 in order to coordinate the military, their military strategy. Some of you may know that Mustafa Talas, I think that Professor Wistrich is probably aware of this, was also the author of a notorious anti-Semitic book, subsequently called The Matzah of Zion, in which Talas repeated the most ridiculous, but for this audience, I think, quite familiar anti-Semitic stories about Jews. Hoffman reported that Mustafa Talas told him that he had unlimited admiration for the fascist blitzkrieg strategy and of the actual accomplishments of the bourgeois German military. And in his report on the trip, Hoffman reported home that Talas expressed a tendency that, quote, is clearly evident among other leading officers of the Arab armed forces. I have found no examples in the East German records of the East German anti-fascists expressing indignation when their Arab counterparts expressed admiration for the Nazi regime and its military accomplishments. Instead, Hoffman raised a toast to the Syrians and to Mustafa Talas in 1971, in which he said that the Syrians would be victorious in your battle against the common enemy. We are fighting against the common enemy. The American imperialists support our enemies in Europe and give Israel money and weapons to protect their imperialist interests. The East Germans and the Syrians were conducting a common battle against the imperialist and Zionist forces, but he expressed confidence that the Arab peoples would be victorious over their enemy, so that he would have to pull his troops back from occupied Arab territories. Part of the rhetorical fog and the game of cat and mouse of communist attacks upon Israel was intentional ambiguity about the meaning of occupied territories. Did occupied territories mean the territories conquered in 1967? Perhaps. But did occupied, because the term was never defined, occupied territories in Mustafa Talas's term could mean Haifa or Tel Aviv or where we're standing today. The relationship, two other points, two anecdotes I'd like to present and then turn the floor over to Robert. The relationship between Erich Honecker and Yasser Arafat was intense. Would you please forward a bit? Those of you who have seen the pages of Neues Deutschland, the East German official newspaper, would have seen many photos like this of a laughing and delighted Erich Honecker shaking hands hugging, kissing an equally delighted and happy Yasser Arafat. At the time, and I assume many people here have read the charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, one of the defining features between the left in the Palestine Liberation Organization and the radical left in the Palestine Liberation Organization was whether or not the Jews who arrived after 1947 would be expelled if the PLO won this war, or whether the Jews who arrived after 1917 would be expelled. But anybody who read the PLO charter in those years understood that the PLO charter, as Israeli scholars had attempted to explain to the rest of the world, was a charter for ethnic cleansing. It was a racist document. And this fact about the PLO charter was never part of the global political discussion of the 1970s and 1980s. It was, and this was one expression of the depth of Israel's ideological defeat at the United Nations. But it was clear that that's what it was about. So when Honecker was celebrating Arafat and sending him weapons, Kalashnikovs, rocket-propelled grenades, landmines, millions of bullets, and we have the details of the shipments. He was sending weapons. His German government was sending weapons to an organization which was involved in terrorism. Another important connection between the East German government and terrorism took place through the offices of the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi. East Germany and the Soviet bloc were intent on sustaining a policy of détente, peace, good relations with Western Europe and the United States. For the Soviets, this was a matter of the establishment of nuclear parity. For the East Germans, it was also a matter of receiving millions of marks from the West German government and more legitimacy in Western Europe. So détente and preserving a modicum of if not goodwill, at least some kind of trust in West Germany and Western Europe was important. Therefore, it was very important for the East German government that Carlos, the Red Army faction, the June 2nd movement, the Red Brigades, not carry out terrorist attacks in Germany or Italy or France that could be traced back to East Germany. Very important, because it would be very quickly evident to the intelligence agencies in Italy and Germany and France and the United States that if people were blowing things up and killing civilians in Western Europe and they were coming from East Germany, that would be the end of détente. And all the rhetoric about peace and cooperation and would be just out the window. You can't come and kill people here and give them refuge and say that you're for peace. So the cooperation between the Stasi and the PLO was to find out where Carlos is. Where is George Habash? Where is the PFLP? Well, oftentimes they were in East Berlin or they were in Budapest. And so the purpose of the cooperation was to see to it that they didn't blow things up in Western Europe. And there are fascinating discussions between Erich Mielke and Mr. Niebuhr in the Stasi and Abu Ayyad and Amin al-Hindi in the PLO intelligence agencies about the meaning of terrorism. And they all agreed that they didn't mince words. There was no discussion about heroic national liberation struggles, or they understood what terrorism is, and they called terrorists terrorists. And they said, well, actually, in certain circumstances we can approve of terrorism, but not if it damages the national interests of East Germany. So they were training the PLO, they were training the PFLP, they were giving them weapons, and if they wanted to engage in terrorism against the main enemies, the United States, outside of Europe, or especially Israel, that was fine. They're very frank about this. So the purpose of the cooperation was to prevent terrorism in Western Europe if it could be traced back to Eastern Europe, but to enhance it or facilitate it in the Middle East. Last point I want to make concerns the war that has been on your minds this year, the War of October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. The East German government, when it was dealing with PLO, was dealing with the instruments of terror, Kalashnikovs, rocket-propelled grenades, and the ammunition needed to kill unarmed civilians. The October War of 1973 war, as I think most of you know much better than I, was one of the most intense military engagements in the world since 1945. Involved much larger weapons and planes, jet planes, tanks. And the Soviet Union engaged in an enormous military resupply operation, both before and during the war. And East Germany played a modest role. And can you flip ahead almost to the end here? These are photos of Arafat in, I think, '79. He's treated as head of state. This is in East Berlin. He's giving the after-dinner speech, thanking Erich Honecker for his assistance, and Honecker then gets up and celebrates the great revolutionary contributions that Arafat is making. Arafat, after the Munich massacre in '72, basically said you have to understand it in the historical context, and Honecker would have understood that Arafat was justifying the massacre, and they continued and intensified the cooperation. Please continue. This is Farouk Kaddoumi. Farouk Kaddoumi may not be a household word to you, but Farouk Kaddoumi was the, as it were, foreign minister of the PLO. He was the voice and the face of the PLO at the United Nations. This is Gerhard Gruneberg, who was the point man in the Politburo, who was responsible for relations with the PLO. This is in East Berlin. More friendship, more serious discussion. This is interesting. Those of you who have been to Berlin and been to Unter den Linden and have seen the memorial to the victims of fascism, the Neue Wache, will recognize that this camera, this photo is taken from within the Neue Wache out onto Unter den Linden, and here is Yasser Arafat. That might be Heinz Hoffmann, I'm sure. This is Gerhard Gruneberg. That's Kaddoumi, paying his respects to the victims of fascism. And now he is in the Middle East fighting against fascism again. More. Let's skip this. This is Hafez al-Assad at the Berlin Wall. Continue, please. Again. All right. In the midst of the October '73 war, two ships left from Rostock, the Freiburg and the Klosterfeld. And this is a map I found in the East German archives. It is a very large map. It's not as large as this, but somebody devoted a lot of attention because they wanted to recognize and honor this marvelous accomplishment in which 2,200 tons of military equipment. Could you go to the next slide, please? Again, I don't know why this is difficult. I'm sorry. There. Okay. There were 62 Soviet T-54 tanks, 300 anti-tank RPG weapons, 30,000 landmines on these ships that were resupplying the Syrians. At the same time that the East Germans were expressing their emphatic, you can turn it off, expressing their solidarity with the Syrians, with the Arab states in the midst of the their unambiguous solidarity, their emphatic, total commitment to the victory of the Arab states in the October of 1973 war. The official position of the West German government was neutrality, even-handedness. even-handedness, neutrality. And it is not perhaps as widely known that in October of 1973, one of the deepest crises in the history of the Atlantic Alliance and in relationships between the United States and West Germany took place. Because as you will remember, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger launched a massive resupply operation to the State of Israel because the State of Israel was running out of ammunition after the first week of the war. And that resupply operation took place mostly with C-5 transport planes that refueled in the Azores, but much of it also came from American weapons that were in West German, American military bases in West Germany. 2 Israeli ships arrived in Bremerhaven to pick up supplies. And the West German Foreign Ministry said to the American ambassador, Martin Hildebrand, in Bonn, under no circumstances are those Israeli ships going to be loaded with American weapons in German harbors because everybody knows where those Israeli ships are going. So if there's going to be any weapons going to Israel, they're going to go on American ships. Because who knows where American ships are going. One of the things that the Israelis learned in the course of the 1973 war was that in the event of war, the Arabs had loyal allies, many, and the Israelis had one loyal ally, the United States.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having come this evening, turned out in such numbers. I'd like to thank Ruchama Roth and all the staff of the Center who once again have done such a splendid job in organizing this event. And Fiamma Nierenstein, Jeffrey Herr for having contributed their comments. Let me try and bring the subject back to the topic of my book, which is a very broad topic because it covers 150 years since the beginning of European socialism and the present day. And it tries to draw certain lines of continuity which demonstrate, first of all, as Fiamma indicated, that there is a powerful tradition of anti-Jewishness and indeed anti-Semitism, not always identical, and subsequently of anti-Zionism and hostility to the State of Israel, that characterizes a very broad sweep of the left in general. And when I say the left, I cover a very multifaceted spectrum of leftist views. There are the socialists of the 19th century, some of them defining themselves as Marxists. There are anarchists, we'll come back to that too. And later there are communists, and then dissident communists, socialists who define themselves as democratic, some as revolutionary, and closer to our own day, there are other sides of the countercultural left, including anti-globalists, and so on. Let me begin, because what I propose to do in the limited time that we have is to provide a kind of brief and as concise as possible guided tour through certain profiles of some of the key thinkers and players in the story of anti-Semitism within left-wing movements until the present. So let me go back to the fons et origo, the fountain of all socialist and especially communist thought, namely the founder himself, Karl Marx. So if we can begin with the man who is buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, but was born in Germany and became the iconic figure after whom an entire movement, Marxism, is named. Of course, since the family's original name back in the 18th century was Halevi, that makes you wonder if they've been allowed to preserve that name, whether in fact you could create an international movement called Halevism. I doubt it somehow. Especially interesting because Karl Marx, although born Jewish, his parents converted him at the age of 6 to Protestantism. He didn't have much time for religion in general, but I would say that his view of Judaism in particular was especially hostile. So here we have, with the first quote, a classic example from his essay written at the age of 26, Zur Judenfrage, on the Jewish question, where he basically equates Judaism in the original German Das Judentum with practical need, with huckstering, in German Schacher, coming from a Hebrew word, by the way, Sachar, Mischar, and he equates it with buying and selling, and with all those unpleasant, somewhat unpleasant traits of modern capitalism without using the word at that time, because he has not yet embarked on what becomes the defining characteristic of Marxism, its analysis of the capitalist system and all its mechanisms. And Marx basically says that Jews and Judaism are synonymous with those features of capitalism which are exploitative. And it's a particularly, I would say, contemptuous description of Jews, or what he calls the everyday Jew, the Alltagsjude, the everyday Jew, in his worldly manifestation. The God of the Jew, of the secular Jew, the empirical Jew, so-called empirical Jew, is the stock exchange. And that really is, for the young Marx, the central point he wants to make about Judaism. Now, beyond that, there's something which has a much more lasting consequence, and it is a rather chilling aspect of socialist and communist thought in particular, namely this anticipation, I would say almost gleeful anticipation, of the disappearance of Judaism, of Jewry, of the Jewish people. Actually, this phrase is used continuously. It begins with Marx, and there's a long line of socialists, including social democrats and communists and others, who see the idea of the disappearance of Jewry as progressive, as something which humanity should look forward to. And note that Marx in this essay talks about the liberation of humanity itself from Judaism. Not that much different from Richard Wagner, who 6 years later writes his notorious essay on Das Judentum in der Musik. Notice also how Marx in 1862 describes a fellow socialist, the founder of the German Social Democratic Party, himself Jewish, Ferdinand Lassalle, with whom he was befriended for a while, who was a comrade in arms, how in a letter to Engels, he describes Ferdinand Lassalle in 1862. And he says, as the shape of his head and the growth of his hair indicate, he's descended from the Negroes who joined in the flight of Moses from Egypt. I haven't actually seen that confirmed by biblical scholars, but now this union of Jewishness and Germanness, Judentum and Deutschtum, on a Negro basis, was bound to produce an extraordinary hybrid. It's not an expression of great fondness for Lassalle, but the question is not whether Marx liked or had reason to like or dislike Lassalle. The question is that this is an extraordinary combination of brazenly racist and anti-Jewish comments. And this is in 1862, while the American Civil War is being fought over, among other things, the emancipation of the Negro slaves. And Marx, who is not only anti-Jewish, but in his private correspondence, talks disparagingly in many places about so-called Negro qualities. At one point, he discusses Lassalle in another context as he talks about his pushiness. And he says that Zudringlichkeit is the term in German. The pushiness of Lassalle is niggerhaft. Niggerhaft, probably I don't need to translate, but we politely call it Negro-like, something like that. So this is just a taste of Marx. But now here's an interesting point. Some of Marx's bitterest rivals in the radical movements, especially the anarchists, and the two foremost anarchist thinkers of the age, Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian revolutionary, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, they not only hated Marx as an individual and detested his theories and often critiqued them in quite a penetrating way, but they always added the fact that they saw all the flaws in Marx's character and in his outlook as being Jewish. And Marx, who spent a lifetime trying to throw off any suggestion of his Jewishness, he was extremely upset if anyone referred to it. This is a great irony. All the people who fought against him, such as Bakunin, who was a terrible anti-Semite. I mean, he makes Marx look almost, philo-Semitic. Bakunin had a remarkable insight that anticipated National Socialism, in which he says that, he says this regarding the communism of Marx, which wants a mighty centralization which will end in the creation of a central state bank. And of course, once that exists, the parasitical Jewish nation, this is Bakunin, which speculates on the labor of the peoples, will always find a means to sustain itself. We move on to Proudhon, whom I mentioned before as an anarchist, theoretician. Proudhon, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, was the most important seminal thinker of French socialism in the 19th century. This quote is amazing. It comes from his notebooks in 1847. It's almost programmatic. He says, demand their expulsion from France, the expulsion of the Jews, with the exception of individuals married to French women. Abolish the synagogues. Do not admit them to any kind of employment. Pursue the abolition of this cult, meaning this religion. It's not for nothing that the Christians call them deicides. The Jew is the enemy of the human race. L'ennemi du genre humain. One must send this race back to Asia or exterminate it. L'exterminer, that's the term. Faut l'envoyer en Asie ou l'exterminer. By fire or fusion, or by expulsion, the Jew must disappear. So Marx says the Jew must disappear through a process of, the abolition of capitalism, if you like. Proudhon wants something much more violent. And frankly, this one quotation is the whole Nazi program of, let's say, 1938, encapsulated. The only thing that's missing, but even the Nazis didn't come to that in 1938, is the gas chambers. That's the only thing that isn't here. Proudhon, I read him as a student at Cambridge in the mid-1960s. I didn't know any of this because you don't find it in books about Proudhon. It's just been written out of the record. So I thought, like most people who are aware of Proudhon's writings, that we're talking about a libertarian, a humanist, and one of the great thinkers who promoted individual freedom. And yet we see, and this is something I think deeply shocking about anti-Semitism that we must wrap our fingers around, that again and again we find in European culture, and to a certain extent now beyond Europe, we find that the worst kind, the vilest kind of hate and prejudice can coexist with noble ideals and the kind of values that we consider to be universal. And this is something we need to get used to because the record is very clear on this. And especially on the left, it's important to address this issue. Next. We come to the British left of the late 19th century. Now, British socialism was a little bit different from its continental varieties. One of the differences was that it was essentially a creation of the trade union movement. The Labour Party in Britain was created by the trade unions in 1900. One of its great iconic figures was this man down below, Keir Hardie, who was himself a miner, a Scottish miner, and he represented a South Wales mining constituency. He was no theoretician. His view of the Jews was not a big issue for him, but he accepted the standard cliches on the British left to the effect that basically the whole financial and capitalist system is ruled by a handful of financial houses, which, as he says, many of them Jewish, to whom politics is a counter in the game of buying and selling securities. I would say that's mild by the standards of the British left at that time. If you want to see what a real anti-Semite, a Marxist anti-Semite, thinks in Britain around 1900, you go to this man whose long beard and striking look is here in the center, Henry Hyndman. This was the man who created the English Social Democratic Federation in 1881, the first Marxist movement in Britain. Hyndman is interesting because he's educated at Cambridge. He belongs to the upper classes. He knows a great deal about the stock exchange and finance. He always wears in his speeches a top hat and a frock coat, and you could say he's an elitist intellectual. And this man actually inaugurates a vicious anti-Semitic campaign when the Boer War breaks out in 1899. The South African War, in which the British Empire eventually defeated the Boers, the Afrikaner whites, who were fighting for their independence. And this war was partly created by what had happened a decade or so earlier, the so-called gold rush in South Africa. And what Hyndman and his fellow socialists in this newspaper, Justice, what they did was to argue that this war had been provoked by the Jews, by a small clique of financial Jews, magnates, most of them of German Jewish extraction. So that added sort of xenophobic element, to the anti-capitalist campaign. And here I took one of many quotes I could have taken from Heinemann. Imperialist Judaism in South Africa is planning an Anglo-Hebraic empire stretching from Egypt to the Cape Colony, and so on. And during 3 to 4 years, this rhetoric characterized many leading figures of the British Labour movement, including MPs like John Burns, who represented Battersea in London. He was a Scottish Labour MP. And what you find during this period is a fully fledged conspiratorial theory. The Jews stand behind an act of imperialist aggression. They've driven the British Empire into a war it had no business fighting for their own personal interests in the gold fields of South Africa. And I was very struck at the time of the involvement of Britain in the Iraq War in 2003, which is exactly 100 years after the Boer War, to find on the left wing of the Labour Party in Britain very similar terminology and claims. The only difference is that the Britain of Tony Blair was engaged in this war alongside the United States because of the links with a Likud-dominated Jewish-Israeli lobby in Britain. As the French say, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose. Next. Here we have two iconic figures of the German social democracy, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Kautsky. Luxemburg belonged very much to the left wing of the SPD and became a founder of the German Communist Party, very short-lived because she was brutally murdered, as you probably know, in 1919. Karl Kautsky, although something of a forgotten figure today, was, in his day, up until the First World War, the most important Marxist theoretician anywhere in the world. Even Lenin recognized him as a major authority in matters of Marxist theory until their paths divided after 1914, and then he became the renegade Kautsky. Kautsky had a great interest in the Jews. Although he was not a Jew, contrary to many legends, even by well-known historians repeat this strange inaccuracy. Perhaps they thought because Kautsky was an intellectual he had to be a Jew, but he was not. He was not a Jew. But Kautsky is another example in terms of the collective disappearance of Judaism and or Jewry. This is the meaning of this quote that I selected. What Kautsky is saying is, as long as Judaism, das Judentum, again, it's not just religion, it's an ethnic group, it's a community, it's the Jewish collective, das Judentum, as long as this continues to exist, we're still in the Middle Ages. It's a relic of feudalism. So there's no place in the modern world for a distinctive Jewish group or Jewish group identity. We have not completely emerged from the Middle Ages as long as Judentum still exists among us. And here we have what I call the kind of progressive, quote unquote, euthanasia of the Jewish nation in the name of progress. And Kautsky, believe it or not, is friendly to the Jews by the standards of his time, and including socialist standards. So what he's talking about, and it's interesting because there are echoes today on the left regarding Zionism and the State of Israel. Kautsky is talking about the self-dissolution of Jewry. This is what Jews need to aspire to. They need to basically abolish themselves, which he claims is in tune with Marx. And to a degree it is, actually, even though Kautsky is, quote unquote, more pro-Jewish than obviously Marx was. Perhaps because he wasn't a Jew. Let's move on to the next, which should be Lenin. Yes, Lenin and Stalin. Lenin is an exception in our story for the very simple reason that I think it would be wrong, unfair, to characterize him as an anti-Semite. Actually, Lenin is a rare case. Not that I'm an admirer of Lenin by any means, and I consider that he wreaked havoc, really, with the modern world and has a great deal to answer for. But Lenin was, if anything, an anti-Semite, such as one rarely finds in such a determined and consistent way in the history of socialism and communism. It's enough to listen, as I once did, to a cracked record from 1920 when Lenin is denouncing the pogroms that are taking place in the Russian Civil War. So why do I mention Lenin here, since ostensibly he doesn't quite fit? The reason is because not just Lenin became such an authority for the world communist movement, and obviously in the Soviet Union, of which he was the founder, but because a few relatively isolated remarks that he made about Zionism, which wasn't a great preoccupation of Lenin, were turned into canonical dogma by the communist movement. And one of these statements I've put up here: the Zionists walk arm in arm with the rabbis. Evidently nobody told Lenin at the time that most of the leading rabbis in Russia and Eastern Europe were actually anti-Zionist. But he says the Zionists walk arm in arm with the rabbis. The utopian and reactionary Zionist idea is rejected by the Jewish workers who resist this agitation and do not migrate to Palestine. The Comintern, the Communist International, went a lot further than that, and they supported, when they created the Palestine Communist Party here, very quickly, despite the fact that at the beginning were only Jews belonged to this party, it was very quickly Arabized, and this was the line of the Comintern, so they supported the 1929 riots and the, in effect, pogrom that took place in Hebron and in other parts of Israel, the land of Israel, Palestine. And they supported even the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, in the mid-1930s and so on. That was the communist line, which only changed really after 1941 or so. So Lenin, without perhaps intending or imagining what the long-term effects of his position would be on Zionism, played a part. The case of Stalin is more complex. I can only touch on it very tangentially, although it's extremely important. I selected a quote. Stalin was not a great theoretician, although, you know, such was his vanity and such was the importance of theory in the Marxist-Leninist tradition that Stalin had to claim that he was an authority in all kinds of areas, whether it was linguistics or economics, or when it came to expounding Marxist-Leninist theory. But in 1913, Joseph Stalin, referred to at that time by Lenin as this marvelous Georgian. I don't know whether Lenin had too much to drink at that point, although he was supposedly a teetotaler. But this marvelous Georgian, Djugashvili, better known as Stalin, wrote a theoretical treatise in 1913 about Marxism and the national question, which became required reading for every communist around the world. And there's a lot about the Jews in this text, 1913, disproportionate. Most of it is a dreary polemic against the Bund, the Jewish workers' movement. There's a lot of polemicizing against the Austro-Marxist theories of that time. But what caught my eye with regard to Stalin's views is something that obviously obsessed him because he twice reformulated it in the text in a rather long-winded way. In one version he says, what sort of a nation is the Jewish nation, which consists of Georgian, Dagestani, Russian, American, and other Jews, who do not understand each other since they speak different languages and inhabit different parts of the globe, and they never see each other, and they'll never act together, whether in times of peace or war. No, it is not for such paper nations. Paper nations. The Jewish people is a paper nation for the young Jugashvili Stalin, right? That social democracy draws up its national program. We can only reckon with real nations. The Jews are not a real nation. Real nations which act and move and insist on being reckoned with. This is interesting that 35 years later, the same Jugashvili Stalin not only recognizes the Jewish people establishing its state here in the land of Israel, but supplies crucial weaponry via the Czechoslovak channels, which enable or facilitate Israel's victory in the War of Independence. And Stalin does everything at that point in time to de facto support the establishment of Israel, even if he quickly changes his line, although not instantly. There's a correct relationship that continues for 3-4 years. In a way, we can understand it even in terms of Stalin's own theory, although there were entirely practical realpolitik considerations that determined it, above all to drive the British out of Palestine and out of the Middle East if possible. And here the Yishuv, which was battling the British, was seen as a crucial wedge. But there was more to it, I would say, than that, even if we don't know the full story. If you look at that early text of 1913, you'll see a couple of very significant points which are usually overlooked. One of them is that Stalin, while trying to explain why the Jews are not a nation, he said they do not have a stratum which is bound to the land. Only 3 to 4% of Jews are engaged in agriculture. These are statistics drawn from Russia, the Russian Empire. And therefore, they are not naturally united in the way that other nations are, which have this strong agricultural base. Remember, in Russia of that time, the overwhelming mass of the inhabitants belonged to the peasantry. By the time that Israel is founded, you have something much closer to what Stalin's conception of a real nation is. So I think that was an additional, perhaps it's always overlooked, but I think one has to get a bit into his mind, his way of thinking, that Israel would have corresponded more closely to his notion of what a nation represented. Next. Now we come to his great rival, arch rival, perhaps the incarnation of a Jewish Bolshevik, namely Leon Trotsky, known or born as Leon Davidovich Bronstein. I think that the most perceptive remark ever made in one single line about Trotsky's stunning and tragic career was made by the chief rabbi of Moscow, apparently in 1919, when Trotsky stood at the height, at the pinnacle of his power, when he was the creator and organizer and leader of the Red Army, and de facto saved the Soviet Union, which would never have survived without Trotsky's brilliance as a military organizer, commander. If you like, he was a kind of Ariel Sharon with an amazing vocabulary and ability to theorize. And what did the chief rabbi of Moscow have to say? His name was Yakov Maze. And he said, the Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the bills. And I'm afraid that for Russian Jewry in the long run, this proved to be all too true, and it has been true in many other cases. It's one of the things I go into in my book. The consequences of the extraordinary romance, quote unquote, of the Jews with revolutionary movements, with the myth, the idea of revolution. The bill that has been paid at the end of the day, and I don't have time to go into that, that deserves a whole conference in itself. Trotsky is a prime illustration. But what is interesting, it's the one point I want to make now about Trotsky. I devote a whole long chapter to him in the book, is that unlike his disciples, the Trotskyists or the Trotskyites, who were still very much alive and present, particularly in France and the United States and a few other countries, as a dissident communist opposition. That's the way they've always been. Since his expulsion from the USSR. The Trotskyites are among the most intransigent and hostile, antagonistic groups on the left towards Zionism in Israel. And, you know, there's plenty of competition in that particular field. But they excel. I have debated ever since my student days with Trotskyites. And you have to really feel as if you're dressing yourself in a coat of armor before you go out to debate a Trotskyite on this subject. There's a level of dogmatism, not to mention tremendous hostility, that is quite remarkable. And they are mainly Jews. All the leading Trotskyites that I've ever met or debated or read are Jewish. Jewish intellectuals. And yet Trotsky was not a Trotskyite. That has to be said in his favor. And one of the best proofs of that is a quote that I bring here, which I think is stunning, that comes from November 1938. I assume it comes after Kristallnacht. And he says the following, it's a prophecy. It is possible to imagine without difficulty what awaits the Jews at the mere outbreak of a future world war, and we're about 1 year away. Even without the war, the next development of world reaction signifies with certainty the physical extermination of the Jews. I say to those, and there are many, including at this university and other universities and around the world, who have said, A, it was impossible to predict the Shoah, and that nobody ever anticipated it. That's a whole big subject I don't intend to resolve, of course, in a couple of words now. What I do want to say is, if that's the claim you make, you need to put this on the table as well for discussion. And Trotsky was, like other Marxists, no great friend of the Jews. When he was asked by the same chief rabbi in 1919 to do something to help the Jews who were being massacred in the Ukraine in 1919, 1920. At least 60,000 Jews lost their lives in this war between the whites and the reds. And here Trotsky was at the pinnacle of the Red Army. He refused categorically to intervene in any way. And he said, "Why do you come to me? I'm not a Jew. I'm an internationalist. I'm a Bolshevik." That's probably what provoked Rabbi Marz's remark about the Bronsteins and the Trotskys. Nevertheless, by 1938, Trotsky had begun to revise his views on the Jewish question, something that the Trotskyites never do. Next. I think we'll leave Isaac Deutscher this time round. Sorry about that, Isaac, but it does happen. A word about Bruno Kreisky, because like Trotsky, he's a Jew, but another kind of Jew. He's a social democratic Jew. He's an Austro-Marxist Jew. The most brilliant political career, in my judgment, of any diaspora Jew since World War II. To come to power in a country like Austria, which has a strong claim to be the most anti-Semitic nation in Europe, as a Jew, never converted, and as a socialist, because he was the first socialist ever to be elected democratically. There was Karl Renner before him, but it wasn't quite the same. Really, in a full democratic election in 1970, to hold power in that country for 13 consecutive years, never to lose a single election. How did Kreisky do it? Well, I can't deal with all the other reasons. There were plenty of reasons. Once I was on a train leaving Vienna train station, and there was this blonde Austrian woman, probably from the Alpine regions, who was sitting opposite me, and we passed a big poster of Kreisky because it was election time. And it said something about vote for experience. So I asked her, "Are you going to be voting for Kreisky?" And she said, "Oh yes, I'm going to be voting for Kreisky because he's so smart." So I said, "Really, klug? You know, klug is the word in German. So why do you think he's so clever?" She said, "Well, he's a Jew." So you see, that's another myth, you know, that's worth exploring. Why are Jews so clever? But Bruno Kreisky was, I have to say it, he was an anti-Jewish Jew. I'm not prepared to say an anti-Semitic Jew, it's a very fine nuance, but he was an anti-Jewish Jew. And the best single example, I could give 10 or 20 of them, but the best single example of that was the Wiesenthal affair. Because the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal lived in Vienna in miserable isolation in those years when Kreisky, you know, the years of his glory, when he was, you know, he was the new emperor, Kaiser Bruno. That was one of his nicknames in those days. And he persecuted and hounded Wiesenthal and made it clear, as far as he concerned, there was no room for any Nazi hunters in Austria, because we have to draw a line over the past. And that made him, in those days, extraordinarily popular. And it was one of the keys, I'm not saying that's the whole story, it was one of the keys to his amazing success. Next. A lot has been said, including by Jeff, about the communists, or at least one particular brand of communism. They're all pretty revolting when you get to know them really close up. But the Soviet version was the single most powerful. And this is from the caricatures. There are thousands of things like this. Caricatures from post-67 of Soviet depictions of Zionism. On the right-hand side, it says in Russian, it says International Zionism. There's this rather grotesque Stürmer-looking Jew. In Soviet caricatures, they all look like Jews out of Der Stürmer, very often anyway. And what's interesting is down below, this is in the early 70s, you have a picture of South Africa and then an eye patch, a Diane sort of eye patch of an Israeli. And those are the two pillars of international Zionism. And of course, the United States is also involved. And here on the right side, we have another Diane-like Israeli with who's got his hands into the, says the Arab lands, Arabsky strany, the Israeli extremists' appetite. It's the whole Middle East. And this bloodthirsty, militaristic Israeli is got his hands, his claws would be better, got his claws deep into the Middle East because their appetite for conquest and their ruthlessness is legendary. And of course, two things which I think, this reinforces a point that was made earlier. Two things which I think the Soviet-style communism and all the satellite nations and the communist bloc drummed into the heads not only of their own population, but of the third world. Let's not forget that. The impact of this propaganda in Asia, in Africa, and also through the channels of the Western communist parties, which were quite powerful, particularly in Italy and in France. These were powerful movements and parties well into the 70s and even beyond. They hammered into the population at a time when it was not fashionable, not like today. It wasn't mainstream then. The notion that Zionism is racism, is apartheid, is colonialism, is fascism, is Nazism, is neo-Nazism, and we could go on with these amalgams. These were communist amalgams, and they never let up. Next. Here are a few odd examples. I'll only take one out of these, the bottom one. One of these hack Soviet propagandists who produced these pamphlets. I used to collect them because they were so cheap. You know, you could get them for like a couple of rubles. You could get this propaganda literature. So I had a whole collection of it at home because there was a period when I was studying this material. A really thankless job, I have to say. But Vladimir Begun produced a best-selling, by that I mean 100,000 copies sold, of, it was called Creeping Counter-Revolution. It's just a little quote, but it's so typical. Zionist gangsterism has its ideological roots in the scrolls of the Holy Torah, holy in inverted commas, and the precepts of the Talmud. Now, why do I choose that? Could have chosen many, many other things. Because there is here something that, you know, you said something very interesting, Fiamma, about the left being between the, you know, regarding the Jews and Judaism, there's something between the dinosaurs and the parasites. Well, both those things are very much alive and present in this type of communist and Soviet propaganda. And they have now infiltrated, intoxicated, and I would say poisoned, thoroughly poisoned most of the left, except for a section, still exists, of the more, I would say, reformist, social democratic left. We see in France with the socialist government, that they do react, they do respond to Dieudonné, but you know, this is not typical these days. Because we're talking about 30 years of intoxication, if not more than 30 years. And here we're talking about Talmud, Torah, and Zionist gangsterism. These are the ideological roots. And of course, the Soviet Union, an atheistic state, as always, you know, encouraged atheism as an official ideology. Once, this is my little anecdote about East Germany. The only time I ever visited communist East Germany was shortly before its collapse. I recall that with some pleasure. And this was in September 1989. I was an official guest. So I actually found my name on the front page of Neues Deutschland, along with a few other members of this delegation. It was supposedly a cultural and intellectual encounter. And in this very impressive state building in East Berlin, we were hosted by a man called Gysi, who was the father of the leader of the very left-wing party today in the United Germany, Gregor Gysi. And he was a Jew. This man was a Jew. And he was a part of the East German communist leadership. And he is amazing that his official title, you know, I spent about 20 minutes speaking with him just around the buffet. And his official title was Minister für kirchlichen Angelegenheiten. You know, he was the Minister of Church Affairs. Church Affairs. There's a Protestant church, you know, there was this is the old Prussia, you know, East Berlin. And so I asked him about that, you know, I said, how come, you know, what are you doing? He was reminiscing about the Weimar Republic. He was a friend of Einstein, he was a friend of this Jewish intellectual and that. He was speaking quite freely. I thought this is a sign that they're kind of defreezing a little bit in East Germany. And then we get into a serious theoretical discussion about Marx. And he knew his Marx, you see. And he said, you know, there's one thing that Karl Marx never understood. You remember those passages where he talks about religion as the opium of the people. There's very striking passages of the young Marx about religion. They're actually quite impressive, philosophically interesting. And he says, you know, that was Marx's biggest mistake, but actually it wasn't really his mistake. It was the mistake, but don't repeat this, he said to me, it was the mistake of our Soviet comrades, because they never understood what Marx really meant about religion, that it has a function, it has a real importance in life, as a consolation. And they took it to mean religion is this terrible thing, it's an opium, it has to be destroyed, it has to be uprooted. He said, I realized it took me 40 years, but I realized what Marx really meant was something much more profound than what our Soviet colleagues, you know, imagined. That's just a little anecdote when the regime is already on its last legs, although we didn't actually know that. So it's an interesting thing. Next, we're getting there towards the end. You know what? I'm going to give a pass. I'm going to give a pass to the third worldism, important though it is, and come to the Garaudy affair. I want to say just very briefly a couple of words about this French intellectual. What is it about French intellectuals? I don't know. You have to be a French intellectual to come out like Roger Garaudy. I mean, this man who lived to be 100, he started off life as a Catholic, and then he became a communist, an orthodox Stalinist communist like only the French communists in Western Europe knew how to be, 100%, 150% Stalinist. And then he becomes a dissident communist in the 60s, and at the end of the 1960s, he criticizes the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe, communist bloc countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. He actually, you know, he deviates from the line, and he's expelled. Expelled from the French Communist Party. You can't say things like that. And then in the 1970s, he moves on. And then comes the great turning point in his life. And to this point, he's not known as anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. He marries a Palestinian woman, a Lebanese Muslim Palestinian, just as the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War in 1982, breaks out. And this is the beginning of the slow conversion of Roger Garaudy into an Islamist intellectual, ex-communist, and a rabid anti-Zionist plus anti-Semite plus Holocaust denier, which leads eventually in 1998 to his being charged officially in a French court and fined heavily for Holocaust denial, which is a crime in France. But at the same time, Garaudy becomes a man of the left, I mean, entirely formed by left-wing concepts. He becomes a great cultural hero in the Arab world. He does this triumphal tour, every Arab capital, and also Tehran. The Iranian leadership, you know, grandiose reception. Rafsanjani hails him, says the profundity, the courage of Roger Garaudy, who stood up to the Zionist lobbies, the all-powerful, you know, omnipresent Zionist lobbies, and who has taught me that only 400,000 Jews actually perished in the Holocaust, and the whole thing is basically a lie and a mythology. And Garaudy, he says the following key points. If we can just move on his key points. The Jews, and I think this comes from his left-wing phase, but it's reinforced and made more virulent by the Islamist addition. The Jews are a cruel and bloody people by nature. The Zionists collaborated with the Nazis already in the 30s and then in the 40s in the annihilation of the Jewish people. That, by the way, was a standard Soviet theme from about the 1970s, and it began even earlier. They control the media in France, in the United States, and so on. And almost the only original point, that the Jews have committed a double genocide. What did he mean by that? The first genocide of the Palestinians, quote unquote, was by Joshua bin Nun. In other words, the assault on the Canaanite peoples was actually an assault on the Palestinians. And then against the modern, the heirs of the Canaanites, the modern Palestinians. All this, of course, grotesque myth, but part of the Palestinian narrative. And just in case anybody thought, you know, there might have been a Jewish Holocaust, he says, well, of course, they exaggerated and invented the Nazi extermination for political ends, which more and more is becoming, I regret to say, this is likely to go on and get worse, it's becoming a bit of a left-wing trope as well. And finally, if we can move to move to the picture of Ken Livingstone. I have to, yes, that's fine. I have to have this wonderful picture of the former mayor of London, Mr. Ken Livingstone. He was the mayor of this great city of London where I grew up and lived for many years, between 2000 and 2008. A left-wing Labourite, a former Trotskyite, although he kept that well concealed once he became very prominent. Welcoming and looking almost, I would say, at Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi with an admiring gaze, because he threw out the red carpet in London twice for Sheikh al-Qaradawi to visit on the grounds that he was a progressive Muslim voice that could help Britain to solve its own internal problems with its Muslim population. And by the way, if you didn't hear this piece of news, it's worth thinking about. Apparently, the most popular boy's name today in the United Kingdom is Mohammed. And the second piece of information is that if you look at the birth rate of the newborn babies, the number of Muslims in Britain, it's like, it's a staggering number, which is going to change the demography of Britain radically. So, of course, that no doubt was already a consideration. But Sheikh Qaradawi, and that's the point of this quote, that a former Marxist, left-wing Labourite, flirts to this extent with an Islamist demagogue, an advocator of death for homosexuals, of female genital mutilation and many other pleasant things, and is a rabid anti-Semite. Sheikh Qaradawi made this remark in 2009, so it's fairly recent. Throughout history, Allah has imposed on the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Adolf Hitler. By means of all the things he did to them, even though they exaggerated, of course they exaggerated, he managed to put them in their place. Hitler put the Jews in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hands of the believers. And this was the man for whom the red carpet was rolled out by a leading light of the British left and a well-known slanderer of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think we had a great evening. I want to conclude with a little Italian episode that demonstrates how true are the things that you say. What? Decided to give the floor to somebody. You have to give.
I'd like to ask a question. After hearing all the evidence that Fiamma and Professor Wistrich and Professor Herman have brought to us about the kind of anti-Semitism that's on the left, and very often, as we saw in the cartoons, the Soviet cartoons of evil Jews, which very much resemble the cartoons or the drawings in the Stürmer by what's his name, Phipps or something, Schiff, whatever his name was. I forget his name now. Now what we have is the so-called right and so-called left. There are similar Judophobic attitudes on both of these sides, both sides there. Now, is there really a necessity today to continue to believe in it, that there really is a difference between a left and a right? I mean, what is the difference, if there is a difference today, when you can find the Pat Buchanan in the United States says much the same as some of the leading leftists in the United States about Jews, Jewish control, alleged Jewish control of the United States government, and similar things. And of course, just to add one more point, there was a Nazi, the American, there's a neo-Nazi movement in America. They like to use the phrase ZOG, meaning Zionist occupied government. That is, that the American government was controlled by Jews. So this has become also a theme on the left, so-called left in the United States. So why do we go on using the terms left and right?
Well, personally, I'm not that in favor of drawing these sharp distinctions, many of which have become anachronistic and don't reflect the reality. So to that extent, I agree with you. What I do think is important, though, and I don't know to what extent you're aware of this, is that people on the left, when these issues that we've discussed tonight are brought up, they are in a state of either complete denial.
That's right.
Or they simply will become very vehement, very aggressive, and will accuse you of playing the so-called anti-Semitic card. This has become one of the new stock responses of people on the left when they are accused or they're presented just with their own anti-Semitism. You are playing the anti-Semitic card. You are saying this because you want to divert attention from quote-unquote Israeli crimes, etc., etc., etc. So that's why it is important to draw attention to the left-wing contribution, because it's so vehemently and vigorously denied. That would be one argument.
I would just add that another reason to address the issues that Robert has discussed so very well this evening is that neo-Nazism or Nazism or fascism is not at all morally and intellectually respectable in the political and intellectual establishment of the Western world. No fascist or neo-Nazi politician has been elected to national office in any Western country since 1945. So when they express lunatic views about the Jews controlling this, that, or the other thing, they're regarded as simply deranged, and they're not taken seriously. But the now 50 years of United Nations resolutions denouncing Israel and 50 years of leftist denunciation of American imperialism and Israeli aggression have a certain moral and political respectability that are part of polite company in Western Europe and in the United States. The people who say these things, as Robert pointed out, do not recognize themselves as anti-Semites and are furious if you suggest that they are anything of that nature, because in their self-understanding, they, more than Robert Wistrich or Jeffrey Herr, are opponents of racism. How can anybody who is opposed to racism possibly be an anti-Semite? The implication is simply an absurdity. I think that the challenge that Robert Wistrich's work poses, in a way, could be posed in this manner. For many, was anti-Semitism in Marx or in Stalin an exception in the history of communism, or was it somehow part of the norm? That remains an issue that is still not well understood or widely discussed in the Western intellectual community. So I think that the work that he's done is invaluable. I would also add this. Because my talk was about more practical affairs. In 1989, in the summer, Yasser Arafat wrote to Erich Honecker, and Farouk Kaddoumi also wrote to his counterparts in East Berlin, expressing their deep worry and concern about Gorbachev, about perestroika and glasnost, and about the young people leaving East Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and the dissolution of communist power. They were extremely worried about this. And the collapse of the Soviet bloc was the most important political and military defeat of the Arab states and the PLO in decades. And it was the indispensable precondition for the era of negotiations. Whatever one may think about the Oslo process, it would not have taken place if the communists and the Soviet bloc had remained in place. So the work I'm trying to talk about your work, trying to say nice things. So anyway, I think that that these points, the points you raise, are important, but the issue of respectability of attacks on Israel coming from the left is one that Robert's work raises very effectively and should receive a lot of attention.
So my answer is that we had in the past anti-Semitism without the Jews, and so there are different places, and you know that. Nowadays we have anti-Semitism without anti-Semites, because there is a complete denial of this, and it is all covered by the idea that this is a legitimate criticism of the state of Israel, the legitimate criticism. This is what everybody repeats, every statesman, every intellectual says, make safe the the fact that the criticism of the state of Israel is completely legitimate, and then he starts accusing it of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing, of any other criminal act that you can figure out. And so again, I will end up my part saying that the book of Robert brings us straight to the point. The point is that what was in the a century and a half ago, anti-Semitism has all converted into anti-Israelism. Because what you see today, and I've seen it from very close, going there in delegations and organizing groups of protest about it, in Hungary, in Greece, these are fringe phenomena. The phenomena of the people saluting with the Nazi salute, these are fringe phenomena. The real big phenomena is the Israelophobia. And this is where the books of Robert brings us, because all of this denial of the Jews having the right to have a history, to be a people with a dignified pretense to their own destiny and state, the fact that the Jews have the right to exist only if they are part of the working movement, if they fight in favor of the Soviet Russia, whatever. I mean, you find many in these theories that are all described in the book of Robert. You find the reasons why you can give the Jews the permission to survive, and they are never connected to their own identity as Jews. They are always connected to the identity of something else, like in this case. So the last thing is that for sure nowadays left-wing anti-Semitism is much more important than right-wing anti-Semitism. That's the reason why the book of Robert Wistrich is so very important, and I'm very glad and very proud that there were so many people asking interesting questions and listening to very interesting